I just want to talk to you about different types of solder. So we've already mentioned silver solder. Silver solder is the most common solder used in the UK. Even if you were working with copper or brass or bronze, traditionally we would still use silver solder. And like we mentioned in the last video, silver solder comes in a range of different melting temperatures, from hard, which is this one, to medium, easy and extra easy. And in terms of the ones you buy normally in this country, you can tell the difference between the solders by the widths that they come in, or you can also mark them yourself or keep them in the bags that they come in. The different names denote how hard or easy they are to melt. Hard is the hardest to melt. The way they make the solder is by taking the core metal, so in this case silver, and then mixing it to create an alloy, which is just a mix of metals, using another metal which has a much lower melting temperature. So for example, with silver solder, it's normally zinc that they mix into it. So hard silver solder has a tiny amount of zinc mixed in, so therefore its melting temperature is similar to that of silver, but just a little bit lower. Medium has a little bit more zinc mixed in, easy has a little bit more again, and then extra easy has a lot of zinc. The more zinc that's in there, the quicker it melts, the easier it melts, but the less silver content you have. So in theory, the less quality it is. So I tend to use hard silver solder for everything, like 99% of the time. But in theory, if you're soldering something that has multiple joins, you would start with hard, and then each time you add a new join, you would work your way down the melting temperatures. This is because you wouldn't want your original join remelting when you're soldering something else on. So for example, say if I've made a ring band and I want to solder it to have a shape on the top, in theory I would use hard solder to solder the ring band together, and then I would use medium to solder the dome to the ring. In reality though, like I say, I find I just use hard solder for everything. I prefer working with it, it's better quality, and I don't have an issue with joins remelting, because you want to keep the heat quite contained to the area that you're soldering anyway, so I find it's not an issue. But in more recent years, although like I say we traditionally use this for copper and brass as well, over from America we've now got copper and brass solder, so I'm going to show you those in a little second. Here we have copper, bronze and brass solder. So it's exactly the same concept. They take the main material, so copper in this instance, and then they've mixed it with another metal with a lower melting temperature, so that this will melt quicker than your piece of copper would. The downside with these ones is they tend to only come in one melting temperature. So unlike the silver where you get the hard, medium, easy and extra easy, you just tend to get copper solder or brass solder, so one melting temperature. The other downside is, to be honest, the colour matches aren't great. The copper isn't too bad, the brass is rubbish in my experience, but the argument is at least it's more brassy coloured than using silver solder. But in reality what you should be doing is getting a really tight join and using exactly the right amount of solder so that by the time you file and sand you can't see it. So therefore it shouldn't matter whether you use this or not. Another solder that you can get on the market these days, which is comparatively new compared to traditional solders, is solder paste. So solder paste is your solder and flux pre-mixed together into a paste form, and then you only need a tiny amount, so it stays in this little syringe, and you would squirt it out onto the area that you want soldered together. Now some people absolutely love this stuff, and it's the only way they work, and it's the only way they've been shown to work. I really dislike it. I always have it on hand for people who want to use it, but it is quite toxic, especially compared to other types of solder. It likes to stick to itself but not necessarily stick where you want it to go. It's quite thick and gloopy, and it's really expensive compared to buying traditional solders, and you've got to look after it, make sure that it doesn't dry out and such. So I find traditional solder much more reliable. You just need to learn how to use it, which I'm going to show you. One of the mistakes people quite often make when they're learning to solder is they cut far too much solder off and use it. You only need a tiny amount. Now that amount changes depending on how thick the pieces you're soldering, how big your join is, all these sort of things. But it tends to be a much smaller amount than you first think. If you get the right amount of solder, you're going to have a very lovely clean join. If you put far too much on, it could spread all over your piece. You're going to have a lot of cleanup to do. If you had a nice pattern on your piece, it could flood into that pattern. So a small amount. One of the ways to make it easier to cut a smaller amount is to actually thin out your solder first. So if you have or have access to a rolling mill, you could roll it through just to thin that metal out, because the thinner the metal is, the bigger a bit you can cut. While still having quite a small piece, if that makes sense. Whereas if something's quite chunky and you cut a small bit, it really does need to be small. If you don't have a rolling mill, it's fine. There's other ways. So rolling mill or no rolling mill, this end's been rolled, this end hasn't. What you can do to make it easier to cut a small bit is to actually cut it lengthways first. So you're cutting little thin fringes into your solder, like so. And then if I just straighten these out, you could use pliers or a hammer to do this. And then what I can do is cut a very small amount, you see, very small amount off the end. And then I know I'm only cutting a little bit compared to chopping off a great big piece like that. It's just going to be too much for most soldering applications. So no matter which solder you're using, if you can, roll it a bit thinner. Either way, cut it lengthways before cutting across, and you'll have much smaller pieces, easier to work with.